Grace Mitchell had seen her fair share of broken dogs. Over 10 years of rescue work had taught her how to read their signs: the trembling tails, the wide eyes, the slow return of trust. But nothing had prepared her for Milo. Before we dive into the story, please leave a comment below to let me know where in the world you're watching from today. He arrived in early October, when the Montana air was starting to smell like firewood and pine needles. The leaves were gold and scarlet, fluttering across the dirt road that led to Grace's cabin. She had agreed to take in another rescue from a recently busted puppy mill. "Just until we find him a permanent home," the shelter manager had said. She'd heard that before. When the crate door opened, Milo didn't move. A small Labrador mix with dusty golden fur and sad hazel eyes, he simply sat in the back corner like a statue. No growl, no tail wag, no curious sniff. Just silence. Grace knelt down, speaking in the soft, practiced tone she reserved for the truly damaged. "Hey there, sweet boy. You're safe now." But Milo didn't respond. He lowered his head, pressing it against the crate wall as if trying to vanish into the shadows. At the cabin, Grace gave him space. She left his crate open near the fireplace, placed a bowl of warm chicken and rice nearby, and quietly stepped back. Still nothing. That first night, Milo didn't eat. He didn't explore. He just sat. The next morning, Grace opened her closet and pulled out a worn cardboard box labeled "Toys, Retired." Over the years, she'd collected everything from squeaky squirrels to tennis balls chewed down to the core. She spread a few around the living room: a frayed rope tug, a plush duck missing one wing, a frisbee scarred with bite marks. Milo looked at none of them. Grace tried not to take it personally. She had seen trauma before: dogs who flinched at raised voices, who wet themselves at the sound of footsteps. But Milo wasn't reactive. He was empty, as if the part of him that once cared about the world had simply turned off. That afternoon, while cleaning out the attic crawl space, Grace found something unexpected: a tiny, faded raccoon plushie. It was no bigger than her palm, with button eyes and a chewed-up tail. She remembered it from years ago. One of her first fosters had adored it. Grace smiled, brushed off the dust, and brought it downstairs, leaving it near Milo's crate without a word. She wasn't expecting anything. But that evening, as the fire crackled low and shadows danced along the cabin walls, Grace saw something move. Milo, ever so slowly, crept forward on trembling legs. He paused near the raccoon, sniffed, then, with impossible gentleness, took it in his mouth. He didn't play with it, didn't chew or toss or shake it. He simply carried it back into his crate, curled around it, and closed his eyes. For the first time, Grace exhaled. Over the next few days, the raccoon became a constant presence. Milo carried it everywhere, to the food bowl, to the corner of the living room, even to the door when Grace took him outside. He still didn't engage much, but that small raccoon seemed to be his anchor, the one thing in this new, bewildering world that felt familiar. Grace didn't push. She knew healing had its own rhythm. She still left toys around, still spoke to him softly, still waited. She began journaling their slow progress. Day 5, he took food from my hand. Day 7, he sat by the window. Day 9, he wagged his tail. Slightly. Yet, for all his tiny milestones, Milo remained locked inside himself. He never barked, never played, never made eye contact for longer than a heartbeat. He was there, but not with her. One late October night, just before the first frost, Grace sat on the porch with a cup of tea. The wind had picked up, stirring dry leaves across the steps. She could hear coyotes in the distance. Inside, Milo lay curled beside the fireplace, raccoon toy tucked beneath his chin. Grace sipped slowly, thinking of all the dogs she'd fostered, the ones who learned to run again, to bark and chase and leap with joy. She wondered if Milo would ever be that kind of dog. And then, a sound broke the stillness. It was faint, so soft it could have been the wind. But it was persistent, a high, desperate mewling. Grace stood quickly, heart racing. She followed the sound to the porch steps and looked down. There, soaked to the bone and shivering violently, was a tiny creature. Not a house cat. The ears were too pointed, the paws too large, the coat too speckled with wild markings. A bobcat kitten, alone, frightened, and crying for help. Grace's first instinct was hesitation. A bobcat? In her arms. But instinct was quickly overridden by compassion. She grabbed a towel and gently scooped up the trembling bundle, whispering reassurances it wouldn't understand. She brought it inside, set up a warm box with blankets and a heating lamp, and placed it beside the fire. Milo didn't move. He just watched from his corner, raccoon still in his mouth. But something shifted in the room. Two broken animals, one space. A quiet breath held between them. Grace didn't know it then, but this moment, this stormy night, this wild arrival, would change everything. Forever. The storm passed sometime after midnight, but the wind lingered, whispering through the pine trees like old ghosts. Grace barely slept. Her thoughts kept returning to the tiny wild creature curled in the blanket-lined box beside the fireplace. She had stayed up for hours watching it breathe, shallow, rapid, then slower as the heat began to take hold. The bobcat kitten had eaten a few spoonfuls of wet food and lapped some water before falling into an exhausted sleep. Its spotted coat was still damp in places, and one paw trembled intermittently as it twitched in dream. Milo had not moved from his corner. He lay curled around his stuffed raccoon, facing the box, eyes half open. He hadn't barked or growled. He hadn't shown fear. But Grace had seen the way his ears perked, how his gaze held steady, how his body remained alert. Watching. Waiting. By morning, the cabin smelled of coffee and cedar smoke. Grace moved carefully around the living room, not wanting to startle either animal. She placed a shallow litter tray under the stairs, refreshed the food and water, and added a folded towel to the kitten's box. She kept her voice low as she spoke to them both. "Well, Milo, looks like we've got ourselves a wild guest." The bobcat kitten stirred at the sound, stretching its front legs with a feline yawn. Then, with surprising agility, it scrambled out of the box and darted under the staircase. Grace froze. "Okay," she whispered. "That's fine. You do what you need to." She turned to check on Milo, but he was already standing, not stiff or alarmed, just aware. He took 2 quiet steps forward, the raccoon toy dangling from his mouth. Then he stopped. He tilted his head, ears rotating forward. Under the stairs, a pair of golden eyes stared back. No sound passed between them, just stillness. The bobcat, tiny, wide-eyed, wild, stayed crouched, half hidden by shadows. Milo stood in full view, calm and open, his body language neutral. He lowered himself into a sphinx-like position, placed the raccoon beside his paws, and watched. The 2 animals remained like that for several minutes. No movement, no noise, just breathing and looking. Grace didn't intervene. She sat on the couch, her cup of coffee untouched, her breath shallow, as if witnessing something sacred. Over the next few days, an invisible thread began to form between them. The bobcat kitten, whom Grace had now named Rowan, after the tree that grew just outside the cabin, rarely ventured far from the staircase. But Milo, who had once avoided every corner of the house, began choosing spots closer and closer to Rowan's hiding place. He didn't force proximity. He didn't drop toys expectantly or bark for attention. Instead, he began a quiet ritual. Each morning, Milo would find one of Grace's retired toys, a squeaky duck, a plush squirrel, a knotted rope, and gently place it a few feet from the stairs. Then, he would lie down nearby, never looking directly at Rowan, but always facing in his direction. It was an offering, not a demand. Rowan, true to his wild nature, was cautious. He didn't pounce or play or respond right away, but he noticed. He sniffed the toys. He nudged them with his paw. And one afternoon, he did something Grace never expected. He pushed the rubber ball. It wasn't much, just a tap, a flick of a claw. But Milo saw it and wagged his tail. The moment was so subtle, Grace almost missed it. But the movement, tentative, shy, hopeful, was the first real tail wag she had ever seen from him. Milo didn't rush forward. He didn't bark with excitement. He just lay there, tail sweeping the floor like a metronome of possibility. Later that evening, Grace was chopping vegetables for dinner when she heard something even more unexpected: soft movement in the hallway. She turned and peeked around the kitchen corner. Milo was dragging a toy mouse toward the stairs. Rowan was sitting just beyond the last step. They weren't touching, but they were sharing space. Milo placed the mouse down gently, then backed away. Not far, just a few feet. He lay down again, eyes on Rowan, posture relaxed. Rowan crept forward, sniffed the toy, then, to Grace's absolute amazement, lay down beside it. That night, Grace wrote in her journal, "Milo shared something today, not just a toy, but a part of himself, and Rowan accepted it. I think something is happening between them, something fragile, something rare." The next few days unfolded like a delicate dance. Milo continued his ritual of offering. Rowan responded with flicks of his tail, slow blinks, and tentative paw taps. Eventually, the two began to occupy the same space beneath the stairs, toys scattered like breadcrumbs between them. Milo, who had once needed to hold his stuffed raccoon at all times, now left it on his blanket while he focused on Rowan. It was as if he had transferred his need for safety into something greater, a desire to make someone else feel safe. One afternoon, Grace sat quietly nearby, sketching in her notebook when she saw it. Rowan stretched out his front paw and let it rest on Milo's foreleg. The contact was fleeting, only a few seconds, but it was enough. Milo didn't flinch. He simply closed his eyes. A bond had formed, silent, powerful, healing. Grace exhaled a breath she hadn't known she was holding. But as the days grew colder and the wind began to shift with the scent of smoke, the quiet peace inside the cabin was interrupted. At 2:13 a.m., the emergency siren screamed across the valley. Grace bolted upright, heart pounding. Her phone lit up with the words, "Wildfire warning." Through the window, she saw it, the red-orange glow cresting the ridge. She had 15 minutes to evacuate. Documents, medications, food, animals. She moved on instinct, grabbing bags, unlocking the truck, throwing essentials inside. Then she called out, "Milo! Rowan!" Silence. She searched the living room, the kitchen, the hallway. Nothing. Smoke crept under the front door. Her lungs tightened. "Milo! Rowan! The stairs!" She dropped to her knees and peered underneath. There they were, huddled together. Milo stood, his body shielding Rowan. He didn't run to Grace. He didn't flinch at the smoke. He stood firm, as if saying, "We're not leaving each other." And in that moment, Grace knew. This wasn't just a dog and a wild kitten. This was a bond. and it was about to be tested by fire. The world outside the cabin had turned orange. The air was thick with smoke, pulsing with the distant roar of the wildfire as it chewed its way down the ridgeline. The siren continued its mechanical wail, an unrelenting reminder that time was running out. Grace coughed into the sleeve of her sweatshirt as she scrambled across the living room floor. Her hands trembled as she reached beneath the stairs, where Milo stood like a sentinel. Rowan was pressed against the wall, eyes wide, chest heaving with every frightened breath. "Milo," she said, her voice cracking. "Come on, buddy. We have to go, now." But Milo didn't move. He glanced at Grace, then lowered his gaze to Rowan. His entire body was tense, not from fear, but from focus. It was the posture of a protector. "Milo, please!" A crash sounded outside. Grace flinched. The fire was closer now. She could hear the crackle of dry pine and the frantic honking of wildlife fleeing through the woods. Her phone buzzed with a final emergency alert. "Evacuate immediately." "This is not a drill." She had 5 minutes. Grace turned back, her eyes burning with tears, not just from the smoke. "I can't leave you. Please, please come." Then it happened. Milo, without breaking eye contact with Rowan, took a single step forward. His nose brushed against Rowan's head, and then he did something Grace had never seen. He gently grasped the scruff of the Bobcat Kitten's neck in his mouth. Rowan didn't resist. With the trust of a creature who had never trusted anything before, Rowan allowed himself to be lifted, awkwardly, carefully, and carried from beneath the stairs. Milo walked toward Grace, his movements sure and calm. Not frantic, not panicked, just determined. Grace stumbled backward, opening the front door wide. "That's it, boy. Let's go." Outside, the air was worse. Ash drifted like snowflakes. The sky was a swirling inferno. The fire hadn't reached the property yet, but it was close. Too close. Milo trotted down the porch steps with Rowan hanging gently from his jaws, and Grace followed, her bag over one shoulder, car keys clutched tightly in her hand. At the truck, she threw open the back door. "Here, Milo, up!" He leapt into the seat with surprising agility and placed Rowan on the blanket Grace had laid out earlier that week. The kitten huddled immediately against the seat, eyes wide. Milo turned back toward the open door as if expecting Grace to follow, and this time, he wasn't the one who needed coaxing. She slammed the door and jumped into the driver's seat. The engine turned over with a cough. The tires kicked up gravel as she sped down the mountain road, dodging branches, her headlights cutting through the smoke. In the rear-view mirror, she saw them, curled together on the back seat. Rowan was shaking, tiny paws pressed against Milo's belly. And Milo wasn't holding his raccoon toy. He was holding Rowan. They drove for nearly an hour, the silence broken only by the distant hum of sirens and the occasional whimper from Rowan. Grace's hands gripped the wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. She couldn't stop replaying the moment in her head. How Milo had chosen Rowan over everything else, even over his own fear. How the Bobcat Kitten, who should have bolted in terror, had let himself be carried. How a dog once too broken to lift his head had become a guide through smoke and chaos. They arrived at the evacuation center around 4 a.m. A high school gymnasium had been converted into a temporary shelter. Rows of cots lined the basketball court. Volunteers handed out water bottles and masks. There were others too, families with kids, couples with pets, elderly neighbors. All of them waiting, hoping their homes would be spared. Grace parked near the edge of the lot and climbed into the back seat with her animals. The moment she opened the door, Milo shifted, placing himself between her and Rowan, just in case. She spoke softly. "It's okay now. You're safe. Both of you." Milo relaxed at her voice and let her reach out. She ran a hand through his fur, feeling how soft it had become, less brittle than before. He looked up at her with eyes that were no longer hollow, but alert and steady. Grace offered a blanket, which both animals accepted without protest. She stayed with them for the rest of the night, huddled together in the truck as the sky began to lighten behind the smoky horizon. By morning, the worst of the fire had been contained. It hadn't reached her property. 3 days later, the evacuation order was lifted, and Grace returned home. The cabin smelled faintly of smoke, but it was still standing. The toys remained scattered beneath the stairs. The raccoon plushie lay on Milo's bed. But something had changed. Milo sniffed the raccoon once, then looked at Rowan, who was cautiously stepping through the entryway like a wild explorer discovering a new land. Grace watched them both, her eyes wet. Milo didn't need the raccoon anymore, not like before, because now he had someone real to protect, and Rowan had someone he could finally trust. Together, they crossed the threshold into a new chapter, one neither of them had known they needed, until the fire brought them there. The air back home was clearer, but the emotional landscape had shifted. When Grace opened the cabin door, Rowan hesitated on the porch. He sniffed the threshold, his sharp yellow eyes scanning every corner before taking a careful step inside. Milo stood just behind him, not nudging or urging, simply present. A quiet reassurance that this place, once a battlefield of fear, was now theirs to share. Grace watched as Rowan padded into the living room, his steps no longer frantic or frightened. He moved like an animal learning to belong. Milo followed closely, his tail low but loose, his eyes flicking between Rowan and the familiar corners of home. The old raccoon plushie still sat on Milo's bed. For a brief moment, Milo approached it. He nudged it gently with his nose, and then walked away. He chose to curl up next to Rowan instead. That was the day Grace stopped seeing them as rescues. They were survivors, and more than that, companions. It started slowly, this new rhythm of life. Each morning, Milo would do his usual patrol of the cabin. Grace had never trained him to do it. He just did. He checked the doors, sniffed the corners, stood for a moment by the windows, as if confirming the safety of the perimeter. Then, he'd return to Rowan. Sometimes, if Rowan was curled up on the window ledge, watching birds flutter by, Milo would place a paw gently on the bench below, a silent gesture. "I'm here." They didn't need to touch often. Their bond wasn't loud, but it was constant. Rowan changed too. He stopped hiding under furniture. He claimed new spaces, like the sunlit patch near the fireplace or the shelf beside Grace's desk. He even began to explore the hallway, his tail held a little higher each time. Grace noticed the small things first. Rowan didn't flinch at sudden noises anymore. He came when she tapped her fingers. He purred, not loudly, just a low rumble, when Milo brushed past him. But the biggest change? Rowan began to give back. One crisp November morning, Grace opened the front door to find something sitting on the welcome mat, a perfectly intact bird feather, long, striped, beautiful. Rowan sat a few feet away, eyes bright. It wasn't prey, it wasn't a trophy, it was a gift. Later that day, Milo barked, just once, firm and low. Grace rushed to the living room in alarm, only to find that Rowan had climbed to the top of the bookshelf and couldn't get down. Milo stood at the bottom, his eyes trained upward, body tense. When Grace reached the shelf and gently lifted Rowan down, she noticed Milo sniff the kitten's ears like a mother checking a child for injuries. And then Milo wagged. That night, Grace wrote in her journal, "Trust isn't just about receiving, it's about showing up." Milo didn't just protect Rowan. Rowan now watches out for him too. They developed rituals together. Milo would retrieve toys, place them in a circle under the stairs, and lie down nearby. Rowan would stalk the perimeter of the circle, then pounce on one of the toys with exaggerated drama. Milo would play along, tail wagging, mouth open in a quiet doggy grin. Afternoons often ended with the two of them sprawled in the sunlight, Rowan grooming Milo's ears, Milo thumping his tail softly in contentment. They never fought over food. They never fought at all. Grace, who had spent years breaking up growls and chasing escapees, found herself watching in awe. Two species, two wounded hearts, now completely at peace. One chilly evening, Grace invited a friend over for dinner, her first visitor in months. She warned her, of course, "Rowan's still a wild animal. Don't approach him. Let him come to you, if he does at all." But when the friend arrived, something astonishing happened. Rowan didn't run. He watched. He assessed. Then, slowly, he stepped into the room, tail low, head high. He walked past the guest and curled up next to Milo, who was lying in front of the fireplace. The message was clear. If Milo trusts her, so do I. Grace's friend gasped. I've never seen anything like it." Grace smiled, her heart swelling with something beyond pride. "Me neither." That night, after their guest left, Grace stepped out onto the porch. The stars were especially clear, scattered like glass across the black velvet sky. Inside, Milo and Rowan were asleep, curled together on the rug. The raccoon plushie now rested on a shelf above the fireplace, retired like a medal of honor. Grace sat on the porch swing and closed her eyes, listening to the wind. These two creatures had come from places of silence and fear. But together, they had written something new, a rhythm of shared breath, of quiet play, of trust earned and offered in return. She thought back to the first time she'd met Milo, how he had curled into himself, unreachable, and how, in protecting Rowan, he'd found himself. Likewise, Rowan had arrived snarling at the world, wild and wary. But now he walked with gentle steps through the house of a woman, a dog, and a past he no longer feared. This, Grace realized, was not just recovery. It was transformation. A dog who wouldn't wag his tail had become a guardian. A kitten who wouldn't be touched had become a friend. And she, the human in the middle of it all, had learned that love wasn't about fixing what was broken. It was about holding space for healing to happen, even if it took months, or storms, or fire. Especially fire. 6 months had passed since the fire. The scorched hills behind Grace's cabin had begun to heal, dressed now in soft green sprigs and clusters of wildflowers that bloomed defiantly against the blackened earth. Nature, it seemed, had decided to rebuild, and so had those within the little cabin tucked beneath the trees. Milo had changed in ways Grace could hardly believe. Gone was the trembling, invisible dog who once curled into corners with a stuffed raccoon for company. In his place stood a calm, confident companion who moved through the house with silent authority. He still didn't bark often, but when he did, it meant something. A squirrel near the window, a strange noise at the fence, a warning not from fear, but from purpose. Rowan, too, had grown. No longer the frightened, underweight kitten trembling in a cardboard box, he had matured into a lean, elegant young bobcat. His coat shimmered with wild vitality, spotted, golden brown, thick and healthy. His eyes were sharp, always watching. But now they held curiosity, not suspicion. In the early mornings, Grace would find them together in the backyard. Milo would roll a tennis ball across the lawn, and Rowan, half serious, half playful, would stalk and pounce with a hunter's precision. Then they'd nap in the tall grass, side by side, limbs tangled, ears flicking in sync at buzzing insects. Visitors had stopped calling them unusual. Now they called them remarkable. Grace had transformed her home to fit the new reality. The space under the stairs, their first shared shelter, was now a play den filled with low shelves, soft blankets, and carefully chosen toys. Rowan had a perch by every window. Milo had beds in every room. And the raccoon plushie, once a lifeline, sat framed in a shadow box above the fireplace, honored, preserved, and finally at peace. Meals had become a quiet ceremony. Milo and Rowan always ate side by side, not from the same dish, but in harmony. Rowan had learned to chew slowly, to wait his turn. Milo, in turn, had learned to look up every few seconds, just to make sure his wild companion was still close. They weren't just coexisting, they were sharing. One afternoon in late spring, Grace received a call from the local wildlife agency. They asked how Rowan was doing, whether he'd shown signs of stress, aggression, escape behavior. She hesitated, not because the answer was unclear, but because the question felt so clinical. "He's thriving," she finally said. "He has boundaries, he has freedom, and most importantly, he has a friend." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then the officer replied softly, "That's more than most bobcats get in captivity." After the call, Grace sat down on the porch steps. Behind her, through the screen door, she could hear the gentle thump of paws on wood. Rowan chasing something, Milo watching. She closed her eyes and whispered to no one in particular, "Maybe we're all a little wild. Maybe that's what makes us family." By now, the townsfolk knew about Grace's pair. Children left feathers and toys on her gate. A local artist painted a mural of Milo and Rowan lying together in the sunlight. The vet clinic posted photos of their checkups, where Rowan calmly submitted to exams beside Milo, never needing sedation. They had become more than a story. They were hope in fur. One evening, as the sun turned the sky to gold, Grace watched from the kitchen window as Rowan climbed to the top of his favorite cat tree on the porch. In his mouth was a toy, one of the newer ones, a crinkly, stuffed squirrel. He looked down. Milo was sitting on the grass, waiting. Rowan dropped the toy. Milo caught it mid-air, wagging his tail. They repeated the game 3 more times. Rowan adjusted his aim. Milo adjusted his timing. Not just playing, but communicating. When the game ended, Rowan leapt gracefully to the ground. Milo met him with a gentle shoulder bump. Then, side by side, they walked inside. Grace stood at the counter, a dinner plate in her hand, tears stinging her eyes. She had rescued 2 broken animals, but they had rescued each other. And, without meaning to, they had rescued her too. That night, as the fireplace glowed and the cabin filled with the soft sounds of night, Grace sat with a mug of tea and a full heart. Milo lay curled in his bed, one paw draped protectively over Rowan's side. The young bobcat, too big now to be called a kitten, snored quietly against his friend's chest. Grace watched the embers dance. She thought about trauma, about love, about what it really meant to heal. She had learned that healing wasn't a straight line. It was a circle, a quiet returning to safety, again and again, until the safety became home. She'd also learned that family wasn't defined by blood, or species, or logic. Sometimes it was a dog with a silent heart, a bobcat with a wild past, and a woman who made room for them both. But every end is just the beginning of something braver,